As you explore Viridian Wildwood, you may be lucky enough to encounter one of the Asmeri Wanderers. If you complete some quests for them, you'll obtain a Wildwood Ascendancy. Now, it's very important to note that Wildwood Ascendancies stack with your regular Ascendancy class. And so today I'm going to get into what each of the Wildwood Ascendancies offers, some special features like Tinctures and Charms, and then a few recommendations for builds to use each of the Wildwood Ascendancies. And if you want to know how I'm applying my Wildwood Ascendancy in a build, well, then do be sure to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there, because that video should be coming out soon. But for now, let's start by talking about the Asmeri Wanderers themselves. You'll encounter the Warden of Eves, Breaker of Oaths, and Primal Huntress randomly within the Viridian Wildwood. The Warden of Eves is associated with Vivid Wisps, so follow the yellow trails to encounter her in the wild. When Vivid Wisps empower enemies, they give them an item quantity bonus, so look out for that as well. Your first 2 Ascendancy points are granted by encountering the Warden of Eves and becoming a Warden of the Maji. Your next 2 are for collecting 4,000 Vivid Wisps. Your third is for defeating the Bile Trio, 3 unique enemies channeling in a ritual found again by following Vivid Wisps. And your final points are granted by defeating the King in the Mists. Then the Breaker of Oaths is associated with Wild Wisps, and wild-empowered enemies gain an item rarity bonus. The first 2 points are again encountering the Breaker of Oaths, so you'll have them as soon as you become a Warlock of the Mists. After that, you'll have to kill 500 cultists for your next 2, and interrupt the King in the Mists ritual by following Wild Wisps to obtain the following points. Last up, defeat the King of the Mists himself, and you'll have all 8. Then finally, the Primal Huntress is associated with the blue Primal Wisp, which are a little bit harder to see. Primal empowered enemies, though, have increased currency drops, so farming them can be very lucrative. Encounter the Primal Huntress to become a Wildwood Primalist and gain your first 2 Ascendancy points. It should be noted that the first 2 points on the Primal Huntress are far less valuable than on any of the other Ascendancies. To get the next 2, kill 500 Nameless, another type of enemy exclusive to the Viridian Wildwood. And to obtain the next 2, defeat the Black Morrigan by following Primal Wisps. Last up, yet again, defeat the King in the Mist to gain the final 2. Now, the quests can be completed asynchronously, meaning if you have the quest from Warden of Eves to defeat the King of the Mist, but you're a Warlock of the Mists currently, and you defeat him, yes, you get your Warlock points, and also your Warden points, and also your Wildwood Primalist points. Furthermore, these areas are item level gated, so you need level 20 zones for the second quest, level 50 zones for the third, and level 80 to encounter the King of the Mists himself. Luckily, whenever you encounter any of the Asmeri Wanderers, you can freely swap your Wildwood Ascendancy to whichever one they represent. And if you want to just respec some points in between, it will cost 1 regret per point, making it fairly easy to respec even on the fly. But for now, let's start looking into the Ascendancies in a little more detail to help you decide which one you're going to use for your current build. So first up, Warden of the Maji. A Warden of the Maji is quite likely an attack build, utilizing deadly tinctures. I guess you could think of Warden of the Maji as the Witchers of Rayclast, hunting down dangerous monsters, primarily carrying 2 blades. Steel for humans and silver for monsters. Now, I don't know if there's actually going to be silver swords ever in Path of Exile, but hopefully we'll at least get a Witcher reference in PoE 2, since it's clearly one of the game's inspirations, and the devs have even said so previously. For now, let's take a look at everything the Warden of the Maji has to offer. First up, Oath of the Maji. This gives you defenses, elemental resistances, max life, or movement speed if you have no socketed gems in one of your items. Furthermore, if you're using an item like Kaum's Heart that doesn't have any sockets, you'll automatically gain the bonus. Because it says no socketed gems, you can still use Abyssal Jewels in Abyss sockets. Now personally, I think the most valuable bonuses are the helmet and the boots. The helmet because while you're leveling and going through the campaign, plus 50% to all elemental resistances is great, and until you fix your gear, this is a really low opportunity cost on everyone but minion builds. Whereas going into the late game, leaving boot sockets open, while a significant opportunity cost at this point, does give you 30% movement speed, which is far better than free onslaught. So if you want to map quickly, I would strongly recommend picking up Oath of the Maji. Next up we have Wildwood Blessing, which grants a level 20 bark skin skill. You gain bark for each second if you haven't been hit by an attack recently, and you lose bark when hit by an enemy attack. 15% increased armor per bark, up to 150%, minus 15 physical damage taken from attack hits per bark, up to negative 150, but 2% more chance to evade per bark below maximum. So if you're missing 10 bark because you got hit a lot recently, or you keep getting hit, you'll get 20% more chance to evade attacks. And you have a maximum of 10 bark, otherwise this would make you pretty darn invulnerable very quickly. This is a buff skill which reserves some of your mana in exchange for granting you the effects. By default, it reserves 25%, but this can further be lowered with mana reservation efficiency. If you want to enhance your bark skin further, you could use Lesson of the Seasons. The problem here is chance to avoid non-damaging ailments per bark below maximum isn't really going to be up much because you want to be near full bark, and while reduced duration of damaging ailments per bark is, I guess, fine to not get poisoned to death, since it does apply to both poison and bleed, it's not perfect either, since you're still going to be afflicted with those nasty non-damaging ailments, and you'll probably want to instead go with something a little bit more permanent like ailment immunity. But I guess, hey, if you're missing some chaos res, then this is pretty good. Just keep in mind that the more times you are hit, the more poisons you'll have on you, and the less effective this will be. But at the start, you heard me mention attacks, and that's where Tinctures come in. Coated Blade allows you to apply Tinctures to equip weapons. Tinctures only apply to attacks made with your weapons, and you can only have one tincture active at a time. They do apply to the attacks of your remote skills like Balliste and Blade Trap. With Nature's Concoction, you can use your tinctures to sustain your flasks, or 2 specific flasks, the ones adjacent to the tincture. They gain 3 charges when you hit an enemy, no more than once a second, so 3 charges a second. And they also have 30% increased effect if you've hit an enemy with a weapon recently being defined as once every 4 seconds. Lastly, we have Enduring Suffusion, where tinctures applied to you have 75% increased effect per empty flask slot. This is not ideal. It's probably fine if you're combining it with the Traitor, but otherwise it isn't particularly beneficial since you're now not only wearing tinctures, but leaving flask slots open, greatly limiting the utility effects that players rely on. And last up we have Detect Evil. Your hits against the marked enemy, meaning you'll have to run a mark as part of your build, cannot be blocked or suppressed. Rare and unique enemies within 120 meters have minimap icons. So I guess this is fine for tracking enemies. Realistically, it's pretty good for the block and suppress negation, but you do need a mark as part of your build. So if you're using one, that's good, and if you're not, give this a pass and take other nodes. Last up, all the small nodes give you a 10% increased quantity of vivid wisps found within the Viridian Wildwood. So now let's come over to the PoE wiki and take a look at various tinctures, since they offer some pretty unique bonuses. For example, the Oak Branch tincture gives you Culling Strike, allowing you to instantly kill any enemies on hit if they're at 10% life or lower. And personally, I'm using a Poisonberry tincture as part of my current build. This means that all of my damage can poison, and therefore my elemental damage can poison. This allows me to use a much higher DPS bow than the traditional Darkscorn used by a lot of poison builds, while also saving expense versus a really GG Fizz bow that was always better than Darkscorn offensively, but also tended to cost over a mirror, at least if we wanted a perfect one. Now, tinctures are unmodifiable, as you can see here, but they roll a variety of stats. As far as I can tell, the stats are pretty much randomized between the bases. They all have different weights, they all have different names, and most of them have different tiers. So, a couple that I wanted to point out. Being able to get Consecrated Ground is really good, as this provides reliable life regen. Strike skills dealing splash damage is very powerful. It might mean that you don't need as many strike additional area or melee splash support. Now for my build in particular, I grabbed Poisons you inflict on non-poisoned enemies deal increased damage. This is yet another source of increased damage for a build that definitely needs it. Though also gaining rage when you hit a rare unique enemy feels really good and stacks up quickly assuming that you hit fast enough. I don't know if this has an internal cooldown, but it doesn't seem to imply it from the text. And you also get fun stuff like projectiles have a chance to be able to chain when colliding with terrain. If you're playing a bow build, then you're probably going to be having a really good time in this league, which is probably why most people are playing bow builds, but to know more about that, you'll have to check out the meta report, which is coming out towards the end of a week. And so, Warden of the Magi is great for attack builds. You do give up some flasks for the additional utility of Tinctures, and you're probably not going to be using Warden of the Magi unless your build interacts with Tinctures. Barkskin is a great defensive, but it's not a reason to give up the powerful benefits of the other two Wildwood Ascendancies. However, Tinctures very much are. They enable cool stuff like LE damage can poison, which hasn't been a thing for bows since the poison bow went away for artillery ballista back in Crucible League. And back then, it was very much exclusive only to that bow and only to artillery ballista. So now we've got way more options, and personally, I'm excited to see the possibilities. Next, we have the Warlock of the Mists, who offers new ways to scale your maximum life, several exclusive curses, and the powerful Ravenous skill. Warlock of the Mists is your Blood Mage, and oh boy does he have some raw power. In fact, right out of the box, I think Warlock of the Mist is the most powerful of the three Wildwood Ascendancies. It just takes a little bit of time to use the others, but don't get me wrong, they get equally strong as well. And so now let's go over some of his unique mechanics. So first up, the Warlock power, which allows you to choose from one of the three options around it, such as Black Mass, granting the level 20 Affliction Hex skill. Affliction puts a curse on your minions, which deal a ramping physical degeneration effect, and heals you proportional to the damage done. This also causes your minions to explode when they die. Yup, it's Corpse Explosion the build with healing, a really cool effect, and a completely new archetype in Path of Exile. On the other hand, Creeping Lobotomy grants the level 20 Pacify skill. The Pacify curse does nothing initially, but prevents the cursed enemy from dealing any damage after 60% of the curse's duration has expired. So you can either have a really long curse with a long burst window towards the end, or a short curse, but only 40% of the time is the enemy able to do no damage. You'll have to dodge around for the other 60%. The curse that's gotten by far the most attention is Choir of the Damned, the level 20 Penance Mark. This does lock you out of using all other mark skills, and it spawns 3 hostile phantasms when you strike the marked enemy. In a level 83 area, these phantasms have roughly 20,000 life. They can be exploded or used to proliferate poisons, and Penance Mark spawns these phantasms once every second. The number of phantasms summoned is scaled by mark effect. So if you've ever wanted to explode a boss, maybe get your Vol skills up, or just trigger on-kill effects for single target, this is a pretty darn good way to do it. In fact, if you've ever played a Worm Blaster archetype, well, now everyone's a Worm Blaster. At least for the low cost of your mark. Just do be aware, they are hostile to the player and will attempt to kill you. If you're taking the Warlock Curses, consider Foul Pact. Enemies pacified by you take 20% increased damage. This will persist for the curse's entire duration. Minions affected by Affliction have Onslaught, so that they can run up to an enemy and blow themselves up even more efficiently. Since the damage ramps up, I don't really expect anyone to keep their minions alive through the Affliction effect. And the Phantasms from Penance Mark have a 50% chance to grant a Vol Soul or grant 50% increased flask charges, making them far better for sustaining your skills. And as cool as that stuff is, there's something even cooler. That is the blood magic line starting with Sanguimancy, which is literally just another name for blood magic. Sangue from sanguine, meaning blood, and mancy referring to magic. Skills cost life instead of mana, reserve life instead of mana, it removes all of your mana, and you have 50% increased life reservation efficiency of skills. So you can get 1 aura for free, or you can start putting auras on your life. If you're looking at flat auras like Vitality or Precision, that's really easy to do with a 50% increased reservation. If you're looking at big ones like Grace or Determination, well, you're probably not going to want to reserve that much life, but maybe if your life stacking going to low life isn't all that bad. In addition, you can lean into this with Crimson Power. This removes all energy shield, so now you are pure life, no mana, no energy shield. You gain maximum life instead of maximum energy shield from equipped armor items. This only refers to the local mods of the item, not global mods that are scaled elsewhere, and you get -6 maximum life per level. Normally, a character gets plus 12 life. With Crimson Power, you will only get +6 each time you level up, at least for so long as it's equipped. Unequip it and don't worry, all the extra life will come rushing back. And last up is Cannibalized Faith, which in my opinion is the way to do this. Spells you cast yourself gain added physical damage equal to 75% of life cost, if life cost is not higher than the maximum you could spend. So as long as your spell's actually able to cast, you get 75% of the life cost is added spell physical damage. And how much is that? Well, without scaling your costs up, you can get about 500 life cost on spells really easily, which means you would get hundreds of base damage, probably as much as, if not more, than a full Awakened support gem. So Cannibalized Faith offers a lot of raw power, especially for Warlock builds that are already stacking life. Funnily enough, we did just see a buff to Reap, so maybe there's a build there. Next up we have Blood Hunt, which grants a level 20 Ravenous skill. When you have Ravenous, you can mouse over enemy corpses to see what type of monster it is, and then consume that corpse to gain a buff. This buff causes you to deal bonus damage against monsters of that type, and take less damage from monsters in the same category. So here we see a perfect Hydra corpse. The corpse type is Eldritch, so you would gain a damage bonus against all Eldritch enemies, including bosses, and take less damage from Eldritch enemies, including bosses. Or you can go with Soul Splitting, where you gain the Summon Dark Effigy skill. The damage you take from enemy hits is taken from the effigy's life before yours. The damage the effigy takes from enemy hits is taken from your life at double the value. So if you have some way to force enemies to attack you and not your effigy, this is really, really good. All the damage will transfer and you'll be fine. But if enemies get to attack your effigy or otherwise AoE it, they're going to cleave you down twice as efficiently, which means it's a very risky bargain unless you have some sort of taunt effect. Last up, all the small nodes just give 10% increased quantity of wild wisps found in the Viridian Wildwood. Now personally, one of the most interesting things about the Breaker of Oaths are his vendor currencies. He sells all sorts of interesting monsters, or at the very least their corpses, and you can specter those corpses to gain bonuses. For example, the Perfect Dark Marionette reforms after being killed, effectively an immortal minion. It explodes on death for 5% of life as physical, fire, and lightning damage, and this explosion can scorch. So maybe combine this with the Affliction Curse to constantly kill your monster, then reform it, then kill it again. Or use it with Maw of Mischief for even bigger boss-killing explosions. On the other hand, the Perfect Naval Officer gives nearby allies plus 10 fortification, a great way to add some additional defenses without having to replace your Kingmaker every time the Animate Guardian dies. If you're playing a poison build, the Perfect Spider Matriarch gives the owner, so not your allies, just you, 20% increased effective Withered. Or a Perfect Spirit of Fortune gives lightning damage, is lucky to nearby allies, which can be an incredibly powerful damage boost, especially when combined with the volatility support that lowers the minimum and raises the maximum. And last up, the signature corpse that we've seen shown off so much, the Perfect Hydra, cast Hatred. Also, this is a Guardian of a Hydra. Good luck making Hydra builds. So who should be playing a Warlock of the Mist? Well, if you're a minion or life build, there's a lot to do here. But because of the nature of Ravenous, it's pretty darn generic. You can often play Warlock of the Mist regardless of what build you are, provided you want to gain one of the benefits from any of the curses, and fill everything else in as you go. Just do keep in mind that if you're going into Sanguimancy, your aura options are going to be very limited, and if you're doing something with the new corpses as specters, their damage and defenses may vary with your investment. So if you're not a minion build, keep all of that in mind. But overall, I would say Warlock of the Mist is often one of the strongest things out of a box, and a great starting choice after you finish the campaign. During the campaign, I'd personally go for Warden of the Maji for either movement speed or all resistances. But when it comes to Wildwood Ascendancies, I've saved the best for last with the Wildwood Primalist, because her charm system is really interesting. In fact, I would almost say it's what Ascendant should have been all along. So now let's break that down a little bit more. So first up, Howl of a Wolf. Your war cries can shake extra items from corpses and open chests. If you're using war cards in your build anyway, this is a great way to get a bit of extra loot, I guess, but most people will not be taking it late into the endgame since it pales in comparison to the charms. And a Wildwood Rucksack, which has 20 inventory slots, about 33% more inventory space. This is required to path to the charm sockets and will always be taken. Then the charm sockets. They do nothing by themselves, but they allow you to place Wildwood charms in them. And these are really cool because they're basically a new item that lets you steal little bits and pieces of all the other ascendancies in Path of Exile. One of the small notes give primal wisps. So here's the basics. There's 3 types of charms. Ursine charms, which roll effects from the Duelist, Marauder, and Templar. Corvine, which roll from Templar, Witch, and Shadow. And Lupine, which roll from Shadow, Ranger, and Duelist. And as you can see here, skills fire an additional projectile. Your hexes can affect hexproof enemies. There's some really powerful stuff that you can use to make a custom ascendancy. So now let's come over to the PoE wiki and take a look at everything we've got here. So first up goes over the very basics of the charms, which ones are which, they are unmodifiable, and now let's go through the mods and pay close attention to some of the spooky OP ones. For example, base crit strike chance while at maximum power charges. Skills fire an additional projectile. All damage can ignite. I can't believe they took all damage can ignite from the Elementalist, which is really neat because even though you could get it as a tincture on an attack build on a spellcaster build, now you can do all damage can ignite Chieftain. All damage can ignite Trickster. All damage can ignite Pathfinder. Okay, maybe you can't do all damage can ignite Pathfinder because I don't know how you'd actually make that into a workable build. But there's a lot of really cool options here and plenty of room for experimentation. If you have any ideas, leave them down below. You've got area of effect per charge, chance to cover enemies in ash. Banner skills have no reservation. That's a really nice one for quality of life. Just throw a banner on your build for a single socket. 50% chance to summon 2 totems instead. Always good for totem quality of life. Consecrated ground, up to 10% increased damage taken. That's a multiplier. Cooldown recovery rate makes it much easier to get breakpoints. And I believe that means you could actually exceed the 10 APS breakpoint, finally, for the first time in PoE history, if you are on a Shadow, stealing the Saboteur node, and you have 3 of these. But don't quote me on that, because I know the numbers are really high. And so maybe even with the extra 36%, you're not quite there yet. But I could have sworn people said before that it was only about 30% off. And even if not, it's still really cool and powerful. What else do we have? Free Cull, crit multi per power charge on a power charge stacker. Remember, you can get 3 charms with this. Endurance charges. Always good to build those into your build. Enemies you or your totems kill have a chance to explode, dealing 500% of their life. It's only 1% baseline, but with 3 of them, you will get a full Chieftain Ascendancy, fully functional, at least the Explodey, all the time. Gain Adrenaline from Champion, Hexes can affect Hexproof, Impales last an additional hit. All really powerful bonuses. Magic Utility Flasks. Mage Blood Enjoyers? Let me know down below. 25% mark effect is quite a lot of damage. If you want to go fast, movement speed per frenzy charge. Projectile barrages have no spread, could make for some interesting not quite Deadeye builds. Up to 8% increased strength for strength stackers. Effective Wither, very powerful stat, since this is a damage multiplier. Extra defenses by applying your armor to fire, cold, and lightning, kind of a mini transcendence. You can get up to 9% of your armor applied in this way. Remember, that's after your elemental resistances. Of course, Fortify if you want that. Flask charges, though it is only a third of a charge per flask per second. Life regeneration rate. If anyone's playing RF out there, they might appreciate this. Minimum endurance and power charges for easy crit and reduction. And a lot of ways to not be stunned. So there's some quite powerful things in here, but obviously not everything's equal, because you have stuff like this and this, which are totally insane. And then you have something like this, which is very mediocre. So you'll have to spend some time looking around on charms and see what is best. Remember, If something comes from a mixed ascendancy class like the Assassin, it can roll on either the Corvine charms or the Lupine charms, rather than just one, the way, let's just say, this is. You'll have to combine this with other dex mods. Unfortunately, I can't really comment on what builds might use the Wildwood Primalist, because at the end of the day, you're making your own custom ascendancy. Instead, I would say, if you don't think the Warden of the Maji or Warlock of the Mist serves your current character well, go Wildwood Primalist. Just keep in mind that some of these charms, especially those for things like skills, fire, and additional projectile, could be exorbitantly expensive, and if that's the case, you might be better off having a slightly worse bonus from one of the other ascendancies than having the perfectly optimal which you can't afford. Remember, it's very easy to swap between the Wildwood Ascendancies. You can pretty much do it at any time, so there's no real harm in swapping to something else until you get a little bit more currency to purchase the charms that you want. That also, of course, means that whenever you're at the Wildwood Primalist, you should absolutely check her inventory, because she could be selling one of those insanely powerful and rare charms on your next visit. So be sure to stock up there, and make sure you don't miss out. Out of all the Asmeri Wanderers, I would say the Wildwood Primalist is not only the most interesting, but the one you should always be checking. Now, for my own build, I'm kind of locked into being a Warden of the Maji, since without all damage can poison, I don't get to use my awesome Ellie damage setup. But for most people, I think your build, or at least your Wildwood Ascendancy, is going to be relatively flexible. So if you're ever unsure, then try stuff, and see how it ultimately ends up feeling. You can always go back into a low-level zone if you want and reset it over and over and over again, A, to complete the first quests, or B, to just find the vendor and reset things. Keep in mind that some of the rewards, in terms of charms, corpses, etc., do kind of sort of scale based off of level, so you won't necessarily want to get everything from a low-level zone. And this also might be patched out in the future, but for now, it definitely still works. I found out that I was missing my third set of Ascendancy points, and did it for like an hour today to get it. Because yeah, it's very, very random, which is quite unfortunate. Now the other tip that I wanted to mention is, the more wisps you collect, the more dangerous the enemies are going to be in your map. Yes, they are more rewarding, but if your build can't handle it yet, it can often be worth it to either leave without collecting too many wisps, or stop by a vendor and spend a lot of those wisps to reduce the overall danger while still getting some value out of a league mechanic. Though again, this is subject to change, because GGG has already nerfed empowered monsters once, and it could very well be that they'll nerf empowered monsters again. And so, I only have one question for you. What's your Wildwood Ascendancy going to be? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you're looking for other Path of Exile advice, like what are the best stash tabs and where do you buy them, I'll link to a video on that up in the card and down below. Or if you want to know more about Wildwood Ascendancies, maybe you need a handy reference sheet, well, I'll link to an article that explains them all in detail over at Maxwell GG. Before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For $5 a month, you'll see your name on screen, just like these fine folks here. Now personally, I've had some mixed feelings about the league so far. On the one hand, the concepts are really cool, and I love what they did with skill gems. On the other hand, the empowered monsters are not the most fun thing, and while I do like the currency explosions, and sometimes you get really cool loot piles, I'd actually rather the enemies not feel like they're 2 or 3 map tiers above the content I'm fighting while I'm progressing. Though I'm sure as I get a little bit more gear and advance my build further, I'll start treating them as little more than very minor speed bumps that slow me down for a couple seconds, in which case I think it's going to be pretty awesome. So, growing pains aside, I am overall positive about the league. But that's all for me today. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.